Today we're going to talk about nature, nurture, and human diversity. To start off with, we must discuss genes and inheritance. So, behavior geneticists are a group of scientists that study the interplay of heredity, otherwise known as our genes, and the environment. We have between 20,000 and 25,000 genes that will make up our DNA. And the interesting thing to note about our genes is that they can be active or inactive depending on the environment that can switch a gene on. So, for example, let's say that you spend a lot of time barefoot, maybe running around rocks, leaves, trees, that kind of thing. Your gene for calluses will turn on and your foot will start to have calluses all over them. But if you never do that, if you always wear shoes, then that gene won't flip on and provide you with calluses. Okay, so 99.9% of us are very similar to each other, and we're about 96% similar with chimpanzees. And what psychologists really care about is that 0.1% that makes us different from each other. So what's interesting to note is that there is rarely one single gene for one certain trait that we have. And tiny differences in genes can actually influence really big differences in our appearance and our behavior. So any trait that we see in a person is the result of a very complex interaction of genes and countless other molecules that we have. We think of this as the human genome. So the human genome itself is the organism's entire collection of all of our genes. Okay, so human genomes are so nearly identical, just like I said, that we can speak of one universal human genome. Yet the very tiny genetic differences make a huge difference. If there's a 0.1% difference in genome, your DNA, for example, would not match the baby. We would not know who the father was. If there's a 0.5 to 0.4% difference in the genome, you might be a chimpanzee, and if there's a 50% difference, you might be a banana. Probably one of the most difficult concepts for students to master in this course would be that of heritability. What exactly is heritability? Now, just memorize this, say it over and over again. It is the amount of variation in the population that is explained by genetic factors. So that means my being different from you can be explained by me having different genes than you have. Okay? So it has nothing to do with telling us about the portion that genes contribute to any trait for any one person. It's not about that. Okay? So let's look at this example here to clarify what heritability is. If 5 unrelated people had nearly identical upbringings, but differed in a trait such as, let's say, shyness, then the heritability of this trait for them would be close to what percent? Take a second, think about it. Okay, if you said 100%, you would be correct. Okay? The reason for that is because they're having this exact same upbringing, all of these people. So we know that any differences that they may have cannot be attributed to the environment. It's got to be attributed to the person, to the genes, to some kind of genetic difference that's going on among people. Okay? So nurture may have influenced how shy they are in a certain way, but because they're all influenced in the same way, so they all had the same nurturing environment, any differences have to be almost certainly caused by genes. Okay, let's do another one. Height. Okay. What is the heritability or the approximate heritability of height? Take a second there and think about it. Well, if you said 90% or close to 100%, you would be correct. We know that the differences amongst people in their height has to do with genetic factors. So how tall mom or dad are will influence how tall the child is. So as I was saying, behavior geneticists are very concerned with parsing apart the effects of nature versus nurture. And there are 2 types of natural experiments that will actually answer this question. The first one is to control the home environment while varying heredity. So that means the geneticist will go in and actually study multiple siblings who have been adopted. So meaning they shouldn't have any genetic similarities other than what we all share in our human genome. they should be selected to look at how similar they tend to be or how different they tend to be. So if they're being raised in the same environment but have different genetic makeup, then we're very curious to see how the environment might make them similar. The next point here is to control heredity while varying the home environment. Now, this one's a little more difficult. Basically, the only option is to have identical twins, which share 100% of their DNA, separated at birth into different environments, and then see how similar they are. So it says here, however, these studies are hard to do. Why? It's actually a little bit easier to find families that have multiple adopted siblings, but it's currently very difficult, especially here in the United States, to find identical twins that have been separated at birth. Back in the 1950s, if a woman got pregnant and she did not want to keep the child, and it turns out she had identical twins, they would be separated. Okay, so we're able to study them, but now, today, a lot of them are no longer around, passed on, and if a woman decides to give up identical twins, they're kept together today. They get adopted out to a family. So these studies are becoming harder and harder for us to do. Okay, so let's take a look at the different types of twins that are out there. The first type is your identical twin. That would be your monozygotic twin. And these are twins that usually share one egg, one placenta. They have to be of the same sex, and they share 100% of their genes, so they have the exact same DNA. Fraternal twins are called dizygotic twins, and they have two eggs, each with its own placenta. They can be of different sexes, and they share 50% of their genes. So that means they're no more genetically similar than any other sibling pair would be. Now at the bottom here, you're taking a look at these two pictures. These are my triplets. And so I have identical twin boys and a fraternal girl. So I have essentially both sets. I have fraternal twins and identical twins. So fraternal twins are much more alike, actually, than any other sibling. So even though they don't have, any more similar genes, in the home environment they share it, they tend to be, because they're being raised at the exact same time in their parents' lives, they tend to be a little bit more similar, if that's making sense. Right? So if you think about siblings, one might be born, and then 3 years later, the next one's born, and a lot of things could have changed within that environment in 3 years, right? Maybe the parents moved, different jobs, that kind of thing. So sibling number 2 is being raised in a different environment a lot of times. But with twins, fraternal twins, they're being generally raised in the same environment, if you think about it like that. So they can be a little bit more similar than other siblings would be. Another thing to note is that even identical twins can have biological differences if they have separate placentas. So this actually will happen in about 1 to 3 times. And if you have a separate placenta, you can get different nourishment, and this will create biological differences amongst the twins, okay? Even though they're identical and they share 100% of their DNA. So here's your question. How do you tell which identical twin committed the crime if you can't use DNA evidence? This is a really big problem, actually. So you may have fingerprints and other bodily fluids that identify somebody, but if they have an identical twin, via the law, you're not allowed to say which one actually, you can't confirm it using DNA evidence. The one way that you can do it, though, is through fingerprints. So as babies are developing in the womb, right, the way that they're moving around is never exactly the same, and that's how our fingerprints get formed. So fingerprints are always going to be different no matter what. Okay, so behavioral geneticists most of the time will compare similarities or differences amongst identical twins to those of fraternal twins. Okay, so this would be that both twins are being raised in the same environment. We call this a heritability coefficient. Okay, so this is just a very simple statistic. And what you're looking at here is the R of the monozygotic minus the R of the dizygotic times 2. So the R is referring to the correlation across many, many pairs of monozygotic twins. So maybe I say, how similar are you on extroversion to your twin? right? And I get a score for each person. And then I do that for 100 identical twins. Okay? The very bottom, I get a correlation that gives me one number that tells me across all 100 of these twins, how similar are they? I do the same thing for the dizygotic twins. Multiply this number by 2, and that will give us a percent as to how similar they are. Okay, so here's an example. How similar are monozygotic or identical twins compared to how similar are dizygotic or fraternal twins? So you're looking at the actual correlations here. So let's just start with the first one. Under self-reports, it says extroversion, 0.45. So that's giving you the correlation coefficient across maybe 100 twins. Okay, so in general, they are similar with an R of 0.45. Move on over to the dizygotic twins, and it's 0.441. So as you move down, looking at all these different characteristics, you realize that the average heritability of many of our characteristics is about 40%. Okay, so based on what we just looked at, we need to realize that not only are identical twins more alike than fraternal twins, but fraternal twins are also more alike than any kind of random strangers. Okay, so they still share similarities, even though the identical twins had much stronger correlations. So here's what we've learned by comparing identical twins to fraternal twins. Personality traits such as extroversion and neuroticism are actually highly heritable. Okay, so that means that if it runs in your family, you're likely to get it. Behaviors such as the rate of divorce is also highly heritable. Now, why would divorce be heritable? Think about that for a second. Why would divorce be heritable? Okay, I'll give you an answer to that. What we think is going on is that there's something, a third variable that's involved that would cause a divorce. So maybe the person's very impulsive, and so impulsiveness is heritable. Maybe it's some kind of addiction problem. Like, so alcoholism, for example, is very heritable. So it's actually the fact that the person is an alcoholic, and that's causing the divorce. And that's being passed amongst family members. Next, abilities such as overall intelligence test scores tend to be highly heritable, and we do know that from twin studies. And from studies looking at similarities between identical twins separated at birth. Remember, now we can't get these anymore because, well, not at least here in the US. Some countries will still separate identical twins, but we don't do it anymore. But from those studies, we have learned that personality, so all these 5 traits of personality, styles of thinking and relating, IQ, attitudes, interest, taste, fears, even brain waves and heart rate are highly heritable, and they tend to be extremely similar across identical twins. Okay, so when I was an undergrad at the University of Minnesota, I worked for the Minnesota Center for Twin and Family Research, and a lot of studies were conducted there. In fact, at a certain time, maybe in the 1990s, early 2000, it was the largest center in the United States for studying twins. And while I was there, my job was to actually find twins that had either been separated at birth or just find twin families that we had been following for a very long period of time. So there's a lot of really interesting stories that come from that experience. And one of them are these 2 guys here. So I remember them pretty well. We talked about them quite a lot. And they're identical twins. And what happened to them was that they were actually adopted into families that were literally 30 minutes away from each other. When we got them and brought them in, then this is before my time, but when they were brought into the center, we found out they had a lot of astounding similarities. So they were both volunteer firefighters. They both had those handlebar mustaches that you see. They were both unmarried. They both liked to hunt. They loved John Wayne movies. They liked going out to the bar, and they would hold their beers in the exact same way with their little pinky underneath the bottom of the beer can. And then after drinking, they both preferred to go out and have a Chinese dinner. They even drink the same exact kind of beer. So it's instances like this which tells us how similar, no matter, even if you're being raised in two different environments, how much genes will play a role in who you actually are. Okay, fun facts about twins. You might be surprised, but twins marrying twins is actually a little bit more common than you would think. Why is this? Well, it's because as a parent, like I'm a parent of obviously two sets of twins or triplets, there's a lot of support groups out there, and there are conventions and lots of different areas to get involved and meet. And now it's Facebook pages where you meet other families that have twins as well, and you can kind of relate to that experience, right? So my best friend currently in Temecula happens to have triplets, right? And so I have two boys and a girl, and guess what? She has two girls and a boy. And we spend a lot of time together with our families. So it's actually a little bit more common for twins to marry each other than you would probably expect. Um, when identical twins, so here's your question. When identical twins marry identical twins, how are their children related? Think about that for a second. Well, if you said that they are siblings, you would be correct. Okay, think about that. Try to wrap your head around it. This couple here, these couples here, sorry, they actually met at a twin convention. They instantly paired off, so each one knew who was right for them. They actually had a double wedding, and Dad walked both of the women down the aisle. And weirdly enough, the two on the left that you're looking at have identical twin boys, even though there's no evidence that suggests that having identical twins would run in families. Interesting. There have been several critiques of studies that compare identical twins separated at birth. The first one is that twins separated at birth, even if that still happens today, which it shouldn't in the United States, will still often know about each other. Because they know about each other, they may influence one another, and that may make them more similar. Number two, coincidences happen. So, in fact, any two people could sit down and find them. If I sat down with any one of you and we talked for long enough, we would find many things that we have in common. Some randomly chosen pairs of people will have very, very similar traits, including even having the same name of a spouse or dogs with identical names. And so that's one of the critiques of those two men that we just talked about, in that we cherry picked and talked about all their similarities and made it seem like they were extremely identical, yet we did not discuss in any way how they were different. Number three, environments that identical twins get adopted into may be similar. So as it turns out, people who are likely to adopt children tend to be similar as a whole in themselves. And families that get chosen, right, for the child to be adopted into also tend to be similar. So as it turns out, if the birth mother is looking for a proper family, a lot of the time, birth mothers will pick very similar families. Number four, their physical appearances may lead them to appear similar. And this means that, let's say you're somebody that's very, very attractive, and so is your identical twin. People will treat you differently based on how you look. Right? So it creates sort of a cyclical effect in that sense. And because of your physical appearance, this will lead you to have similar environmental experiences, that being that people will treat you in a similar fashion. However, none of these factors explains better than the genetic explanation for why fraternal twins have more differences than identical twins. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about adoptive relatives. So actually, there's been studies performed with adopted children for whom the biological relatives are actually known. And similarities between biological and adoptive parents to the children have been examined. Given these findings, what we find is that adopted children seem to be more similar to their genetic relatives than their environmental or their nurture relatives. Knowing this So, given the evidence of genetic impact on how a person turns out, does parenting or nurture make any difference on how adopted kids turn out? That's the big question. Well, as it turns out, just in terms of personality traits, I'm not talking about anything else, just personality traits, so how talkative you are, how extroverted you are, how neurotic you are, that kind of thing. It turns out that the similarity among adoptive siblings, so two people that have been adopted into the same family, doesn't exist. It's otherwise known as negligible. So the R, our correlation coefficient here, is only 0.05, which tells us they're not similar at all, which tells us the environment had no effect on how they would develop in terms of their personality. Well, Judy Harris put out this book, and it really made a huge splash. I mean, she's basically saying that it doesn't matter. This implies that the neighborhood, the home, the income, the nutrition, the parents' style of rearing doesn't matter in how a person will turn out. So this really flies in the face of developmental psychologists and also implies that there is no need to remove a child from an abusive home. So this is the what do you think? If we teach people this, that parenting doesn't matter, then why would you bother taking a child out of an abusive home? So it's really important to make sure that we don't teach parents, our people, or our senators, or our presidents, that parenting doesn't matter. Okay? It does have an effect, but in a lot of different ways than you would expect. On the heels of this book, the question was asked, if parenting does have an influence, then why are siblings so different? Well, you have to remember, number one, fill in the blank. Siblings only share half their genes. Yes, this is on the exam. Number two, genetic differences become amplified as people react to the siblings in a different way. So if you're slightly different in one way from your sibling, the environment, people around you will respond to you in that way. So if you're somebody that's very, very friendly, then you're going to get a response from the environment, from people. They're going to want to be your friends. And then you're going to have more friends. And that's going to make you more friendlier. And that'll continue on. If you're somebody that's very, very shy, you'll get a response from the environment, from other people, to kind of back off, leave you alone. And as more people start to stay away from you, the more and more introverted that you may become. Number three, siblings are raised in slightly different families. So I've already kind of talked about this earlier on. But if you think about it, the firstborn is having a completely different experience than the lastborn within a family. So when the firstborn comes along, there's no other siblings to share the parents with. Right? So the firstborn is having all these experiences with just mom and dad. But then when the secondborn comes along, the secondborn has to deal with that firstborn. And by that time, like I said before, it might be years later, and the environment might have changed. Maybe the parents changed jobs, moved, that kind of thing. So siblings are actually raised in slightly different environments if they're born at different times. However, I do want to stress the fact that although we see that in terms of personality, it's true, we are much more similar to our biological relatives than we are to our adoptive families, if that's the case. We still know that parenting has a strong influence on religious beliefs, values, manners, attitudes, your political attitude in particular, and even certain habits that you may develop. So parenting does have an influence. Temperament is also another difference that we see among siblings that's not caused by parenting. So as it turns out, all babies are born with a temperament, and that appears to be very genetically based. So there's three types. We have your difficult baby, your easy baby, and your slow to warm baby. So for the easy or flexible babies, they tend to be happy, regular in their sleeping and eating habits, adaptable, they tend to be calm, not very easily upset. As these kids grow up, so I'm sort of filling in the blank here, what happens as they age? As these easy babies grow up, they just become your regular average person that you would normally deal with on a daily basis. Your difficult babies, about 10% of babies are born as difficult. And these children might be really fussy. They'll have irregular feeding and sleeping habits. They might be fearful of new people and situations. They get very easily upset by noise and stimulation. And they have very intense reactions to things. So what we think is going on with these difficult babies is that it's possible they're being born from a mother who may have had some kind of addiction. So it may be they're being born with FAS, fetal alcohol syndrome, and those babies can be much, much more difficult to deal with. As they get older, what we find from the difficult babies is that they tend to wind up being much more impulsive. By the time they hit their adolescence, they tend to be more aggressive, and they tend to be more conflict prone. Last, we have our slow to warm babies, and that's about 15%. This is a very interesting one because it's not a temperament that you would have expected to come out of your genes. But these people are actually children that are much less active, and they also tend to be fussy, and they may withdraw or react negatively to new situations. But over time, they may become more positive with repeated exposure to people, but they don't really like new people, and they don't really like new objects or new situations. So as these kids age, by about 8 years old, the slow to warm are very, very shy, and a good half of them will end up as introverts. So you might notice that this doesn't add up to 100% because people don't add up to 100%. So a lot of people kind of fall between these categories. Okay, so understanding how nature and nurture works together and the interaction of the gene and the environment. How does the interaction work? Well, there are some traits that we have, such as the overall design of our bodies, that are set by genes. So if I ask this question on the exam, which I believe I have, if I said to you, how heritable are arms, what would your response be? Well, if you said close to 0% or even 0%, you would be correct. Because if you look around, everybody has arms. And if somebody's missing an arm, it's usually due to some kind of environmental effect. So other traits, such as physical and mental abilities, develop in response to experience. So someone who's predisposed to depression, they have that predisposition triggered by chronic stress or hormonal changes. These can lead to lifestyle changes, which can then reinforce the depression and even change the activity in the brain. And again, some environmental influences can turn genes on or off. So genetic traits influence the social environment, which will also in turn affect behavior. And there's two different ways that we see this happening. The first way is through self-regulation. So genes will actually turn each other on and off in response to environmental conditions. So one example of this, we see it in animals. Shortened daylight triggers animals to change their fur or to hibernate. Another example is the one that I brought up earlier about walking barefoot. So if you spend a lot of time walking barefoot, that will trigger your genes to produce calluses. The next way we see this genetic influence based on our social environment is through epigenetics. So here, the environment acts on the surface of genes to actually alter their activity. So an example of self-regulation in humans through epigenetics would be obesity that we see in adults. Right? When an adult is very obese, that can actually alter their genes and they will pass those genes on to their kids. So this obesity in adults can turn off weight regulation in the genes of their offspring. So then the offspring is much more likely to have weight problems. Okay, so we're going to move on to talking about evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary principles are used in evolutionary psychology to explain human universals and commonalities that we have. These are qualities that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce and spread those traits to the genes of many of their offspring. Okay, and here's how evolutionary psychology works through natural selection. So we begin with a species genome, which contains a variety of versions of genes that shape traits, which lead to conditions to make it difficult for individuals with some traits, some versions of those genes, to survive long enough to produce or reproduce. Other individuals thus have their traits and genes selected to spread in the population. Okay, so how might evolution shape the human species? Well, one example is what we call stranger anxiety. And this is developed between the ages of about 9 months and 13 months for children. So during this time, kids tend to get very, very fearful of somebody that they don't know. But prior to these ages, they'll let anybody hug them, hold them, and they're generally fine. So what might explain this? Well, in evolutionary or survival terms, humans are learning to walk during that time. And so as kids are learning to walk, infants who use their new ability to walk by walking away from family and maybe toward some kind of predator like a lion might not have survived to reproduce, as well as those who decided to cling to their parents around the time they learned to walk. It also appears that we have some kind of unconscious ability to pick the mates that are right for us. We do this via pheromones, and pheromones are a chemical aphrodisiac that is secreted and carries with it information about our immune systems, impacting the behaviors of those in the vicinity of us. So one classic example of this is the t-shirt study, which we're going to watch right now. Its main focus is that women tend to dislike the smell of their brother's t-shirt, and they tend to prefer the smell of a t-shirt of a man who has an immune system least like hers.
Another deeply embedded instinct we may have inherited from our ancestors is the ability to smell a genetically compatible mate. In one unusual experiment, scientists had young men sleep in the same t-shirt for a couple of nights, until the shirts were infused with their unique smell. It turns out, when women were asked to rate the sex appeal of the different men based only on the smell of the shirts, they consistently rated higher the shirts of men whose immune genes were unlike their own. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Choosing a mate with different immune genes gives offspring a greater protection against viruses, parasites, and other pathogens. The ability to smell good genes is a remarkable talent. But like most instincts, we don't even know it's at work. We just like the way someone smells, or the way they look, or because they make us laugh.
People don't have sex because they want to perpetuate their genes. They don't like someone because they want to get better genes. They do things because they feel good to them. They have sex because it feels good. The relationship between those good feelings and gene survival may not even be known to them. They never think about that. They do things because it feels good, and they never think, why do those things feel good? Why have we evolved a brain that makes certain things feel bad to us or certain things feel good to us? And that's the question that we're addressing.
Okay, so one of the big questions that evolutionary psychology asks is, why is there this major mating preference difference amongst men and women? And so what we normally see is that generally men think more about sex and women, and men generally are more likely to think that casual sex is acceptable, whereas women are not. Now, if you're just looking at evolutionary theory, and I want to really stress to you that we're talking about a theory here, not a fact, why might natural selection have resulted in greater male promiscuity? Okay, think about that for a second. Okay, so if you came to the conclusion that men who had the trait of promiscuity were more likely to have their genes continued and even spread, you would be correct. So in that, if you think about it, there is a little cost to spreading their extra genes to as many women as possible. However, for women, a trait of promiscuity would not greatly increase their likelihood of survival. Okay? They may increase the number of babies, but can they, first of all, giving birth is something that is very dangerous, especially back in the day when we didn't have the medical advances that we do. So for a woman to continuously give birth, it increased the likelihood that she would eventually die during childbirth or after childbirth. So it wasn't a good idea for women to be very promiscuous in this way, according to this theory. Evolutionary theory also tries to explain why we seek certain partners. So one thing that you see in almost all developed countries and cultures is this older man with money with this younger, beautiful woman. So evolutionary psychology tries to explain why that is. So what we see is that men seek young women with fuller figures. So believe it or not, men actually prefer women with, a little bit of, like, you might want to say, like, meat on their bones, that kind of thing. Why is that? And women seek men who are loyal and have resources and money. And why would that be? Well, here's what we think. Answer to why, number one, is that men prefer mates in order to perpetuate their genes. So they're looking for mates that are most fit for reproductions. And these tend to be women who have bodies or hips that will probably successfully produce a baby. So they're not going to die in childbirth. That means afterwards, when the baby's born, mom is there to take care of the baby and feed the baby. So these fuller figured women tend to be more likely to get these babies out, according to evolutionary theory. And if they're young, they're also more likely to be a little more fit and more likely to be able to carry the baby through. This makes sense. Now, why do women seek these loyal men who have resources, power? Because once the women have the baby, they're in a very vulnerable position. Right? So they're breastfeeding the baby, perhaps. They can't do a lot else. They need somebody else to provide resources, provide them food, right? Provide them a place to live. So men who are able to provide usually tend to be a little bit older and more established in their careers, according to this theory. Evolutionary psychology has actually tried to test this theory. And one of the things they find is that men tend to get much more sexually jealous than women, whereas women will get much more sexually or much more emotionally jealous than men when it comes to cheating on their partners. Okay, so here's what you're looking at. The blue bar is the men and the red bar is the women. And the first one here is focused on sexual aspect of the affair. So the men find out that maybe the wife or the partner is cheating. They're very focused on exactly what happened in terms of the sexual part of it. Over here, the next two bars, it says focused on emotional aspect of the affair. Now, men are a little bit less concerned about how emotionally attached she might be to this person, but women are very, very concerned about how emotionally attached that man might be to the person he's having an extramarital affair with. Now, according to evolutionary psychology, the explanation for this makes sense. So what they're saying is that men are worried that they might end up giving their resources to another man's baby. So if the woman is cheating and she's having sex with somebody else, it's possible she could get pregnant with that person, and he would end up giving his resources to somebody else's baby and helping that person's genes move along. For women, they're more concerned with the idea that they need somebody to help them with the resources while they're taking care of baby. And if the man ends up having this emotional affair and walking away from her, she's going to be in trouble. So she doesn't care so much if he's having sex here and there, because that doesn't take away her resources. But if he gets emotionally involved, then he might leave her, according to this theory. Okay, so taking a look at these bodies, I often ask my classes, a show of hands, which one do you believe is the one that most men prefer? And it's kind of funny. I see a lot of variation depending on where I'm teaching. In certain areas that are closer to LA, I find a lot of people believe that it's the 0.6 or the 0.65, so that's a waist to hip ratio. But in fact, what most men tend to prefer is that one in the middle there, the 0.7. And that's in the Western cultures. So the 0.7 in Western cultures is the most desired. However, males from South America and Africa actually prefer this waist to hip ratio that looks more like the 0.8 or even a 0.9. The reason that we believe men prefer these bodies is because they have this waist to hip ratio, which usually signifies a woman who can carry a baby to full term and that she and the baby will survive. Question. People who have distinctive features are typically viewed as most attractive by others. True or false? Well, if you answered false, you would be correct. Now take a look at these faces. Which one do you think is the most attractive? So again, I've done this for many of my classes, and the large majority tend to say the one on the bottom left is the most attractive face. And believe it or not, that face right there, if that's the one you said, is actually a composite of all the other faces. So that face includes male faces and female faces, yet we tend to find it the most attractive. And take a look at these faces. Which one is most attractive? Generally, again, people will say the one all the way over on the right-hand side is the most attractive. And again, that's a face where we put two faces, these other two women's faces, together to produce this third face. So what makes an attractive face? First of all, facial symmetry. So if I were to draw a line down your face, a vertical line, and split your face in half, and compare both sides, the more similar they are, so that means your eyebrows are the same, your eyes are the same, your cheeks are the same, the spots on your face are the same, the more similar they are, the more attractive you will appear to other people. The reason for this is because facial symmetry means that it likely signifies somebody's resistance to infection and harmful pathogens while they're in the womb. For those who have facial asymmetry, so again, I'm splitting your face down here, and your eyebrows are kind of in different spots, and your nose is kind of different on one side than the other side. With the asymmetry, it kind of increases the presence of genetic problems and also may signify exposure to environmental disturbances in the womb that you were not able to overcome. So we find people with this asymmetry less attractive. And then we have here the averageness hypothesis, which is what we just got done looking at. So a composite of many faces is much more attractive than any one face. And that's because as we continue to lay faces upon faces upon faces, they begin to average out the slight differences between both sides. And then that face to us becomes more attractive. So now we're going to watch this video.
Anyone or anything that reproduces sexually is constantly thinking to itself, who am I gonna mate with? We spend a lot of time thinking about mate choice because passing on your genes early and often is how you win at being alive. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's the most important thing you will ever do if you do it. And due to its extreme importance, it is also very complicated, you may have noticed. Our general understanding of it comes from Charles Darwin, who proposed that some individuals get more action than others because of sexual selection. You've heard of it. One gender of a species consistently prefers mates with specific traits, so individuals with those traits pass their genes on more often and spread their genes and the traits throughout a population. Old Charlie was certainly on to something. Take a look at this peacock. Some would consider this overkill, but to the ladies, a big frothy rack of feathers shows that a dude is healthy and has good genes. So as a result of sexual selection, male peacocks have evolved to look like 1970s Las Vegas showgirls. Humans, like peacocks, have evolved to like some traits more than others, and these preferences date back to a time when those traits gave an individual huge survival advantages. So in most cases, beauty is actually a language that conveys information about health and fertility. But if you're thinking that it's all about boobs and big muscles, think harder. You know what really turns us on? Bilateral symmetry. Humans are attracted to people whose bodies and faces look the same on both sides. How am I doing? Anybody? Symmetrical imbalance can mean someone was exposed to some kind of stressor during early development that they weren't tough enough to deal with. Similarly, a low waist to hip ratio drives both dude and lady humans wild. Where fat is deposited on a body is determined by sex hormones, testosterone in men and estrogen in women. Women who produce the ideal amount of estrogen generally have waists that are about 70% the width of their hips. Same goes for men and testosterone. People with this ideal ratio are often less susceptible to cardiovascular disorders, cancer, diabetes, and women in this range also have less difficulty conceiving and giving birth. Now you might be wondering, why will a nice symmetrical guy with an ideal waist-hip ratio make you feel kinda meh, but he's got your friend driving by his house 3 times a day? Well, one reason could be in our genes. Everybody gives off subtle chemical signals called pheromones which give potential mates a clue to our genetic profiles. Crazy, right? Studies have shown that men and women are generally attracted to pheromones of individuals that are genetically similar to themselves, with one major exception. They prefer mates with a different kind of immune system gene called major histocompatibility complex, or MHC. The combo of 2 variations of the MHC gene helps a couple's offspring fight off disease better, and our pheromones basically tell mates which version of that gene we have. But even after you account for pheromones and symmetry and ratios, it's complicated, and people don't make rational decisions, so really don't bother with those hair plugs or that boob job. It's complicated, and yet so awesome. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow. In the comments, tell us what makes you attracted to a potential mate. Also, if you have any questions or ideas or comments, you can leave those down in the comments or get in touch with us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you want to continue getting smarter with us all the time, you can go to youtube.com/SciShow and subscribe.
So knowing this about genes has led to artificial selection and a lot of controversies that surround it. Particularly, especially here in the United States, we had the controversy of eugenics. So eugenics is this belief that humanity could be and should be improved through selective breeding. This actually ended in the United States just in the 1980s. So when I started working at the University of Minnesota and obviously going to school there, they were just getting rid of that eugenics department that existed. So many universities had eugenics departments where they tried to figure out the best way to breed humans. So how do you decide who is inferior? That's the real question. Well, if you want to think about one good example of this, it would be Adolf Hitler. Hitler promoted eugenics. He believed that people were best off if they had blue eyes and blonde hair, even though he himself actually had dark hair and dark eyes. Sperm banks got involved and jumped on board, and they started stocking up on people who had certain traits. So they were more likely to take sperm from somebody who was taller, had a higher IQ. They even went as far to contact Nobel Peace Prize winners and ask them for their sperm. So the salespeople would literally contact these people and they would pay them to get their sperm. So the major problem was that it led to the belief that any fault people had was going to be due to their genes and not the environment. Today, about 13,000 people identify themselves as either a member of what we call a stolen generation or relatives who were adversely affected by the long-standing policy that was put in place in Australia. So what they tried to do in Australia was basically breed out Aborigines. So based on the premise that full-blooded Aborigines were a race headed for extinction, up to 100,000 mixed race children were taken from their parents. Between about 1910 and 1970. The children, some of them were babies, were snatched, literally snatched from their parents and sobbing mothers by policemen or government officials in attempts to bring them into Australian society and raise them as the white person in Australian society. Here in the US, throughout the first six decades of the 20th century, hundreds and thousands of Americans and untold numbers of others were not permitted to continue their families or reproduce. They were selected because of their ancestry, national origin, race, religion, and a lot of them were forcibly sterilized, wrongly committed to mental institutions where they died in great numbers, and prohibited from marrying in America. So we have a long history in America for this act of eugenics, the idea that certain people or certain traits should not be continued on. Okay, so we're going to shift a little bit right now, and we're going to talk about moving on from the genes to the role of the environment, and more specifically, how our parents, peers, and the culture around us will affect who we become. So first we start with peers. As psychologists, we used to believe that the utmost important thing when your kids hit adolescence was to make sure that you raise them around the right friends. So you move to the right neighborhood, and you ensure that you know who your kids' friends are, because we believed that the peers had such an incredible influence. Through a lot of research and a lot of studies, today we understand that the peer influence isn't as strong as we believed that it used to be. So even if you take, your money and it costs, you can live in this really expensive neighborhood, pay a lot of money in taxes to live there, to have the best schools, and make sure that your kids' friends have the best types of friends that you want for them. It doesn't matter as much as you would think, because what we think is going on, what we find is going on, is there is a selection effect that happens. So if you have a child that is prone, for example, for some kind of addiction, maybe smoking or drinking, they will manage, no matter where you raise them, to find the one other person of their age group that is also prone to these things. So as it turns out, raising them in the quote-unquote right neighborhood doesn't matter as much as you would think, because what we do and what kids do is we end up self-selecting no matter what. So if we're prone to be smokers or we're prone to be drinkers, we're going to find others who do that as well. Okay, so here are your fill in the blanks. We want to know, what's more important? Is it parents or peers? Especially when, kids get around the age of 11, 12, in adolescent years, we're very concerned about it. Well, here's what parents have a positive influence on. Self-discipline. So believe it or not, parents actually can teach a child to be self-disciplined. This means getting up at the same time every day, doing their homework, cleaning around the house. The more a parent pushes a child to be disciplined, the more likely when that child leaves the home, flies out of the nest, they will be more self-disciplined themselves. So that's a really important one. Responsibility is the second one here. So teaching a child to be responsible, letting them know you're in charge of your shoes, you're in charge of your clothes. You have to take care of this, not me. And if they don't take care of it, they lose it and you don't replace it. Responsibility is something that you can teach kids at a very young age. I do this all the time to my kids. One weird thing that I just recently started doing was telling them that they couldn't leave their toys out in the living room anymore. They're older now. They're over 6 years old. And so I keep telling them, put your toys away, put your toys away. Well, this has been going on for months. And toys are just everywhere. So I finally said one day, that's it. If I find any more toys laying out here after you're supposed to put them away, I'm throwing them in the garbage. And I literally did that one day. Everything that was left out after they'd played with it went into the garbage. There was a lot of crying going on. But guess what? My living room has been clean and all the toys get put away every single day since then. So that's teaching responsibility. And you do that through these natural consequences. Right? So if you're not responsible, you lose it. I don't replace it. Next is religion. So parents have a very strong influence on how religious their children will be. So if you're in a family that's atheist, for example, it's very likely that your children will remain that way throughout their entire lives. Or if you're in a family that's very religious, Catholic or Lutheran or Muslim, it's very likely that child will remain in that religion their entire lives. Okay, so we're going to move on over here to peers. So what do peers influence? As it turns out, learning the path to popularity is very important. So if your child ends up being friends with the popular kid, your child will actually learn what kind of social skills it takes to be popular. Peers also have a strong influence, so number 2, on music, so the choice of music that your child's going to listen to. And they're obviously going to have a very strong influence on clothing that your child would wear. Right? Lastly, and this is probably the most interesting one, is that peers are much more likely to have an influence on language, and in particular, an accent. So we see this all the time. Like a couple parents may come over from a different country and they have an accent. They have a child here in the United States. That child is raised around parents with this certain accent, but yet the child doesn't develop it, interestingly. So the child learns to speak and takes on the accent of their peers, of where they're being raised, not from their parents. Even though they hear their parents talking to them in this accent all the time, they won't pick it up. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the influence of culture. So what is culture? Culture is our very specific behaviors, ideas, values, and traditions that are shared by a group of people. And usually they're transmitted from one generation to the next. But the truth is, all of us can adjust to a new culture. It's not like ethnicity, which is more set. Once we get into that culture, we experience what are called cultural norms. These are standards by which we live by. They're shared experiences and rules that are reinforced by parents, friends, teachers, and also the society as a whole. When we move to a new culture, we may experience culture shock. So we don't realize that the culture that we live in has these certain norms and rules that we just naturally follow until we move somewhere else. And then we have to deal with these different paces of life and the importance in particular of punctuality. So if you were to move to, say, Japan, you would find out that Japan keeps very exact time. So if they say, I'm going to meet you at 1:30, it is exactly 1:30 when they meet you. And people tend to be much more hurried in Japan than in many other places in the world. However, if you were to go to, say, Indonesia and say, I'm going to meet you at 1:30, people are extremely leisurely there. And if you were to arrive at 2 o'clock, nobody would bat an eye. So there's these norms that are very different. Germany is another one. So in German culture, we call it a very tight culture. They're also, the rules of the culture are very much adhered to. So for example, if there's a stop sign and no cars around, everybody stops no matter what. Okay, so what you're looking at here is an example of a street in Denmark. And women or parents will leave their babies outside stores and go inside and shop. They'll even go inside and have lunch. And nobody steals the babies. There's never been any kind of problem like that. And the parents believe that it's good for the babies to stay outside breathing the outside air as opposed to the air inside these stores or restaurants. Well, In 1997, a Danish woman was arrested in New York for leaving her 14-month-old baby in a stroller outside a restaurant. Can you imagine this? New York City, a baby is left in a stroller. A woman goes inside and starts eating. Immediately, somebody came along, freaked out. Why is there a baby left out here? Called the police, and the mom was actually arrested. She actually went through a week-long trial, so she had to stay in the United States a little bit longer. And she told the jury that she'd always been able to leave her daughter outside restaurants. And as it turns out, this photo was used during the trial to prove that in Denmark, yes, it is true, people leave their babies outside in strollers. The most common way that cultures have been compared and studied is via individualism versus collectivism. So in other words, it's like saying you're either in an individualistic culture or you're in a collectivist culture. Personally, I do cross-cultural research, so I don't believe that you can really split them up that easily. But for the sake of this course, we're just going to move on. So if you grew up in an individualistic culture, such as the United States, you would be somebody that values independence. It's all about you. It's all about being unique, being an individual, taking those beautiful duck face pictures and posting them on your social media. Okay. It's all about your own personal achievement. So when you graduate from high school or college, it's all, look at me, look at what I did. So it's very much based on being an individual and how the individual can survive in an individualistic culture without the help of anyone else. Now, collectivist cultures value interdependence. So this means it's very important to work within a group and stay within this group. So usually it's a family, and you identify yourself not as being a unique individual, but as somebody that's part of a group. So maintaining these connections and fitting in the group is extremely important. And what happens in these groups most of the time is that they have very few different groups that they would go to, and they don't have a great range of friends because they tend to like having these very few close, enduring relationships. And if these people succeed, like let's say they graduate from college, for example, they say, thank you to my family. Look at what my family did for me. It's not about me. It's not what I achieved. They say, my family is what made me achieve, or my group is what made me achieve. And so there's this push away from focusing on the individual, but focusing on everybody else around them. So the problem with splitting up cultures to say that one culture would be individualistic and the other one would be collectivist is because we find a tremendous amount of variation going on within cultures. So for example, China is classically considered to be collectivist. However, it depends on where you're at. Shanghai, Hong Kong, Beijing, all these places show us that there's a tremendous amount of variation going on within the culture. We also see that in Japan as well. So Japan as a whole has always been seen as collectivist. But if you go into certain areas like Tokyo, you find out that people are extremely individualistic. Okay. So looking at this here, we're looking at how social people would be in a place maybe called Shy Land, and how social people would be in a place maybe called Party Land. So although it's true that people that live in Party Land are much more outgoing and social, and the people that live in Shy Land are much more self-isolating and introverted, there's a tremendous amount of overlap. There's a tremendous amount of people within each of these cultures that acts the other way. Right? So there's a lot of people in Party Land that are shy, and there's a lot of people in Shy Land that are partiers. Okay, so that wraps it up for today. And again, if you have any problems, questions, issues, please contact me.